Well, good afternoon, technically good morning. Thank you for being here today to our Leading with Care conversation. Before I get started, one of our wonderful volunteers shared a quote with me this morning from Rosalind Carter. There are only 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, and those who will be caregivers. Those who will be caregivers and those who will need caregivers. We are here today to celebrate our 1.5 million family caregivers. I hope this conversation today will inspire you to join us and act in support of Ohio's 1.5 million family caregivers who are faced with navigating an increasingly complex and growing scope of family caregiving challenges. Whether assisting spouses, siblings, grandparents, neighbors, and other loved ones so they can live independently in their home where they prefer to age, or providing much needed support for loved ones in assisted living and nursing homes. Ohio's family caregivers are the backbone of a fractured long-term care system. Without this vital support, many older Ohioans would be forced into costly nursing homes with the government and taxpayers paying the bill. The care families and friends provide is invaluable for those receiving it. It is a precious resource for the communities, cities, and states wrestling with the realities of an aging population and fewer family members or friends to provide the care. The estimated economic value of Ohio's family caregivers' unpaid contributions was approximately $21 billion, which does not include the cost of lost wages and out-of-pocket expenses. They also spend more than $7,000 out of their own pocket on care-related costs each year. That adds up. Half of women who are caregivers leave the workforce entirely or reduce work hours due to their caregiving responsibilities. Shortages of direct care workers translate into higher hours and higher intensity of caregiving. We know that nearly 60% of family caregivers spend over 11 hours per week providing unpaid labor to an older loved one, and 40% spend over 20 hours per week doing so. Family caregivers need support. They need common sense solutions that will save time and money. Policies supporting Ohio's family caregivers will help address the workforce needs across the state and support the strained long-term care system. Addressing the needs of family caregivers is not something we need to think about for the future. We need action now. The need for support is urgent and critical. We're inviting you on this journey today. On your table is a small card in which you can share your story as caregiver or someone receiving care and sign up to help us advance policies that support Ohio's family caregivers. Today's event is about sharing the challenges of Ohio's family caregivers, celebrating policy victories that will help us care for our loved ones, and reimagining the future of caregiving in our state. We want to ensure that older Ohioans have the support they need to choose how they want to age. And now it is my pleasure to start our panel discussion. I'd like to introduce our moderator today, Lauren Anthis, who is the head of external affairs at UVU Health. He also serves as visiting fellow for value-based healthcare at the Center for Community Solutions. He holds board and committee positions with the May Dugan Center, Magnolia Clubhouse, and Better Health Partnership. Lauren is also a lecturer at Ohio University's Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine. Thank you, Lauren, and we're lucky to have you today.
All right, hello everyone. I first want to start by thanking Holly, Kelsey, and the whole AARP team for inviting me today. Hopefully they won't realize the terrible mistake they've made until much after the presentation. I also, just as a sort of a point of personal privilege, want to congratulate the work that they do and that many of you do in the aging space. Little known fact about me is that the reason I got involved in public policy in the first place was because I became a caregiver at a very early age, taking care of my mother who had frontotemporal dementia. And it was through that experience that it became important to me to get involved in the civic space and understand the policy frameworks that drove a lot of the reasons why our family was facing what they were facing and led me to this career. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the opportunity to be here today. It's definitely a privilege and an honor. I'll start by introducing our panelists, and then I'd ask them to spend 3 or 4 minutes just to provide a little bit of an introduction and a background. We'll sort of go down the line. But with us today is Colleen Marshall, NBC4 News anchor, attorney at Colleen Marshall Law, LLC. Karen Hensley-Rayburn, Director of Community Relations, African American Alzheimer's and Wellness Association. Orion Bell, President and CEO of Benjamin Rose Institute. Jennifer Heston-Mullins, PhD, LISW Associate Director of Research, Senior Research Scholar, Scripps Gerontology Center, and I've definitely taken a lot of their work before in my advocacy work. So we'll start down the line.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Jennifer Heston-Mullins, and I'm engaged in this work and passionate about family caregivers because I have both professional and personal experience with caregiving. I became a family caregiver when I was 19 to a grandparent, and then subsequently continued to care for other grandparents after that, and then professionally worked as a social worker in long-term care supports and services for around 15 to 16 years before going into research. So some background in terms of helping families navigate and seeing the struggle for families to navigate our systems and our services, and then also as a family member having that experience, particularly for individuals living with dementia. And so there are some unique challenges, of course, related to that. So I'm glad to be here and be part of the conversation today.
Well, good morning. My name is Orion Bell. I am the president and CEO at the Benjamin Rose Institute. We are a nonprofit based in Cleveland, Ohio that focuses on the needs of older adults and the families who care for them. And as an organization, Benjamin Rose for the last 30 years has really been involved at the forefront of developing effective family caregiver supports. My personal journey with caregiving started at a really young age because I have a brother with significant developmental and physical disabilities. And so caregiving conversations were a part of our household for as long as I can remember. So I sort of accidentally found my way into the field, but there was just a lot of the resonance of a conversation about working with an older adult population that's similar to the needs of families caring for a loved one with a developmental disability, or a young family may be coping with the impact of a serious illness or a significant accident. So the needs of caregivers are universal. They're not about the disease you have, they're about the role you play as a caregiver.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Colleen Marshall. I am here because I was one of the family caregivers. My mother lived with Alzheimer's for 10 years. And I'm here from a caregiver's perspective in that I saw how much of a strain it was physically, emotionally, financially, how it sometimes had families not agreeing on the best steps forward. There were 4 children in my family. 2 of us, I was one of them, were deniers. There's nothing wrong with Mom. She's fine. She's just a little forgetful. We just lost Dad. She's always been nervous. I came up with every excuse that you can think of for my mother's behavior. And until I finally had to accept what was happening. And I think some of you have been through that, and I look back now and think, would things have been different if my brother and I would have accepted this sooner? My older sister was the one who kept saying, something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. And she's always been the boss of me, so I didn't want to listen to her. What's she know? But then, of course, we all got on the same page. And it is, I just was speaking with a caregiver. It is, as you know, an exhausting journey. I started, after my mom's diagnosis, an annual program called The Journey Through Alzheimer's, and I'm going to give myself a plug. It airs tomorrow night at 7:30. So that's how I got here.
Hi, I'm Karen Hensley Rayburn. I'm Community Outreach Director with the African American Alzheimer's and Wellness Association. Professionally, I'm a pharmaceutical rep, and I've been doing that for over 25 years. So from a healthcare perspective, I have an understanding. I've worked in nursing homes, hospitals, doctor's offices. My mother, I cared for my mother. She had vascular dementia, which is under the umbrella of Alzheimer's. And I did not live at home. She lived at home with my father, but I watched my father morph from my mother's husband to her primary caregiver. And I watched as we were losing him. Because culturally, a lot of African American families, we take care of our own people. Historically, probably because we didn't have options, and that's just always how it's been. As long as I remember, my grandmother lived with us, my mother's mother, and she died when I was 8. And then when I was in college, my dad's mom moved in. So we just have always had, and they didn't have dementia, but they were older. So when my mother started to fade, she babysat both of my children, and she was she was there every morning at 7:30 in the morning. She picked out an outfit for my son. They had a regimented schedule. And then my second child, I started him into daycare part-time. And I remember one day I'm running out the door for work, and she goes, wait, what do you want me to feed him? And I was like, lunch. Like, what do you mean, what do you want me to feed him? And then one day I came home, and there's like ice cream coming from the bottom of the refrigerator, and she put an ice cream pie in the refrigerator. And I was like, Mom, what are you doing? She's like, oh gosh, so I just thought, but you're busy with life, so it's, so we went to the doctors, and like, maybe we'll get a baseline or something. And he's like, well, she is 72, we'll say, 72. And she's like, watch your mouth, But is it aging, or is something going on? So once my son went to school, and she didn't have that rigid structure anymore, it was really fast, the change. I call her, because I used to see her every day, and I'm like, what'd you do today? Oh, a little of this, a little of that. And I'm like, that's what you did yesterday. So, but she was accomplishing nothing because she couldn't decide what to do. So it was slow initially, but once she lost the structure, it was fast. And so I became a part of the African American Alzheimer's and Wellness Association as a result of looking for opportunities for her. That's why I'm here.
Thank you for all of you for sharing that. So at some point you were caregivers, or you might still be caregivers. So just thinking through that a little bit, were you able to find any supports? And how hard was that? Were there any challenges? And do you have any advice for anyone who may be a caregiver or who might become a caregiver? And anyone can start. This doesn't have to be so procedural.
So, I think the first sort of awareness of that as an issue was that my grandfather had a significant stroke in his mid-70s. And he lived another almost 15 years after that. And the challenges that watching my mom and her sisters trying to figure out what to do in the mid-1980s to allow him to stay at home. In the days before there was a lot of the home health agencies and attendance services. You had a little bit of things like visiting nurse service, but that was pretty much therapeutic.
Certainly wasn't telemedicine, right?
And the struggle to find anything available. Right. And then a few years later, as my brother aged out of the public school system and was at home all the time, and there was nothing available in the way of community programming or day programming in existence in the late 80s, early 90s. The difference between 30 years ago and today is pretty remarkable in terms of the options that are available. And so I have a lot of optimism that we will figure this out in some way. But I think the real challenge sometimes is that for many people, short of being completely impoverished by it or completely overwhelmed by a medical condition, the resources are pretty limited. We're not sick enough or poor enough, but that's 95% of us. And finding ways to help people navigate that system, not just at the extremes, but as you move through that process, I think is very important as we think where the policy goes.
Yeah, Colleen?
I would add that I think a lot of it, too, is where you live.
Right.
I'm from Appalachia in western Pennsylvania, a former coal mining town of 1,000 people. That's where my mother lived. There were no services available there. And as far as I know, there probably are still no services available there. I turned to the Alzheimer. I lived here. I had a brother and sister who were still at home, in that area, and another sister in Virginia. But I turned to the Alzheimer's Association here and got a lot of information. But as far as services, it's very limited geographically. And I think it would be the same way if you go into southeastern Ohio or some of the Appalachian counties in this state. Services are limited. At-home care, respite care, it's very difficult to get. My sister took an early retirement. She was a teacher and took an early retirement to help care for my mother. While she was still teaching and my brother was working full-time, my brother is a psychotherapist, he had a practice, he was working, they couldn't be with her every single day, and it became very difficult. And I remember there was a Meals on Wheels program that did start in that county, in Fayette County. And my mother was like, well, I'm not taking charity. I'm not going to have, she just absolutely wanted nothing to do with it. So my sister was so smart. She said, Mom, they started a new restaurant. And they're looking for people to review the food. And they're really hopeful that you would sign up. And just all you have to do is write just a short list of tips. And so my mother would write, that needed more salt. And she would do a review. So this Meals on Wheels guy would come by, and every day she would give him the review from the day before of the food. But then she thought she was working. So, you get these management techniques that you get. And the one piece of advice that I would give to everyone, as difficult as this conversation is, talk to your parents about their finances. Talk to them about their finances. My sister had a woman pull her aside in the bank and say, I could get fired for this. You have to find out what your mother's doing with her money. My father had died. She had my dad was an electrician. This is not a wealthy family. She had money in the bank from his insurance policies. And you know what happens when you give to a charity? They sell your name to 500 other charities. My mother would get a charitable notice in the mail, and it would say, would you like to give $20, $50, $100? She thought they were all bills. And she gave away thousands of dollars without our knowledge. She was draining her bank account because none of us had the nerve to say to her, what are you doing with your money? So finally, Maureen, when she looked into it and realized, oh my God, what has she done, took over her finances. But even if they aren't to that stage, it's important to talk to your family about where the money is, how they access it, what are they doing with it, are they having trouble managing their bills, did they forget how to add and subtract? Again, I'm coming from this from Alzheimer's. Not everyone has Alzheimer's, but that's my biggest piece of advice. Handle the money.
Yeah, that's some good pieces of advice there. I hear one, talk to consumer advocacy organizations, realize the current context, maybe have a little bit of humor. But this financial piece is important, and I want to hit on something that's important to this discussion too, since we're in the right forum for it. And looking at these numbers too, there's about 1.4 million family caregivers providing roughly $20 billion worth of benefit to Ohioans alone through family caregiving. And those are dollars that are not being spent through Medicaid, through other programs. So I guess my question for you is, without these systems, how important do you think it is to provide some support financially, otherwise, to family caregivers, and what kind of support should there be?
Well, I think it's incredibly important, and not just from the financial aspect, but using finances to help take some of the challenges off the table that can help out with some of the out-of-cost expenses, because caregivers are also dealing with a tremendous amount of emotional pressure and circumstances that many of us don't have to deal with on a regular basis. They're dealing with big issues, independence and autonomy, and how do you navigate risk and safety, and those take a lot of energy and a lot of emotional capital to be able to do those things. So anything that we can do to make life easier from a financial standpoint, I think, is incredibly helpful. Modifications to homes, that's another thing in terms of providing support for modifications for homes, for providing support for in-home equipment. Those kinds of things can transform the environment to just make life easier. So having those types of financial supports, either through grants or through other types of programs, I think are very important.
Please.
Yes. Additionally, for those of us that aren't to that point yet, long-term care insurance is golden. We were fortunate. My mother had long-term care insurance. My father doesn't. How did one of them end up with it and not the other? But long-term care insurance, I don't even know why she had it, or what happened. But with having that, then you have the opportunity to, get reimbursed for programs once you can find one, or having someone come to your home. Because my mother was just pleasantly aloof. That was her, they'd go to church, go to dinner, and she'd come over and I'd say, "Oh, I'm making dinner. Would you like some?" She said, "Sure." And my dad said, "We just ate." She goes, "Oh, what did we have?" She just, didn't remember. So, but it was frustrating for him because, he'd do these things and then, or he'd cook dinner and then she didn't like it. Or he'd help her get her shower and get ready for bed. And then he'd finally go sit down, for the first time all day. And then she comes in the room dressed and he was like, "Why are you dressed?" She was like, "Well, aren't we going to start the day?" And he's just like, just exhausted. So to know what resources are there. So you were speaking before in the 80s, we're fortunate to have the internet. That's where the first place I started, because I thought, we need help and I don't even know what to do, or who to talk to. So of course I've heard of the Alzheimer's Association, and then I saw African American Alzheimer's Association, so I thought I'd see what was the difference between the two as far as what they offered. But I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know what I needed. I didn't know what would help my dad or what would help me help my dad, because I had two small kids and I have two older brothers. Not that brothers aren't helpful, but oftentimes they're not as helpful as daughters. And so I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know where to start. And my dad, my dad didn't feel like he needed help because he said, "I know how to take care of my wife." As a wife, but not, this is a totally different situation. So figuring out where to start, because even if there's the Alzheimer's Association, I don't even know what to ask for. I think my mom has dementia,
Well, that brings up a good question too. I know from a policy standpoint, other states have introduced legislation for state income tax credits for family caregivers, allowing up to 50% of eligible expenses to be a part of that credit system. Working with caregivers or being a caregiver yourself, do you think that would be a helpful support? Is that something that Ohio should take a look at?
Absolutely.
I think there's opportunities to look at tax credits, other kinds of policy too, because the biggest challenge with caregivers, and a lot of times it's especially with women who are in and out of the workforce more than the guys are. The long-term effect of that is a reduction in their lifetime earnings, which means less in their 401k, less in their Social Security, less savings. They're more financially vulnerable because of that. A tax credit would help with some, but it doesn't address
the totality. Yeah.
So are there other kinds of supports that also make that possible? You know, we can also look for, are there things that make it easier for people to move in and out of the workforce? Are there things to promote policies in companies to do that? We offer a caregiver support program at Benjamin Rose that's offered through an employee assistance programs, but not every employee assistance program does that. We have some insurance plans that say, you know, we'll do some outreach to family caregivers and ask about that for somebody, but only a handful do that today. So there's a lot of other things we can do with that, where promoting policy and encouraging of that, some of that is around tax policy, but some of it's just about promoting incentivizing other things that make it easier, make it more practical for people to receive that kind of care.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to talk to my employer about the EAP program you just mentioned.
Also, I'd like to add to that, employers can provide caregiving days in addition to personal days. So next year, our company, the company I work for, will allow X amount of days, you know, because, you know, you've got sick days, you've got personal days, but, you know, you have to take your parents to doctor's appointments, or, you know, or maybe the person that was going to come take care of them can't, and you're the person that needs to do it. So you end up eating up a lot of time, and sometimes you don't have any time left, you know, and then you're having a conversation with your manager because you need to do it, you know, so.
I would add to that too. I've often wondered why the state, you know, we know that there aren't enough home health care workers. There just aren't. The state has programs where it pays home health care workers in an effort to keep people from going into nursing homes. Why aren't we providing pay for people who are at home caregiving family members? Why aren't we supporting them financially when they are taking on a role that would otherwise drain the healthcare system? There should be some kind of a pay system, and I'm not saying for all 100 and however many billions of unpaid work hours, but I don't know why there isn't a system where at least part of the week, people who are keeping their loved ones out of nursing homes and out of systems that would drain taxpayers, why they can't be paid for the services they're providing that home health care workers would otherwise be paid for.
And Jennifer?
Yeah, as we've been having this conversation, I think whatever policies we look at, we really need to think about how flexible they can be and how inclusive they can be for the different types of family situations and the different type of caregiving arrangements there are. So we do have some programs where family members or others can be paid to work with someone that they know, consumer-directed programs and participant-directed programs, but there are regulations and requirements about who can serve in those capacities. Some of those things were relaxed, so in terms of spouses being able to be paid, legal guardians, there are restrictions around that. So thinking about how we can broaden the flexibility in those policies. And sometimes we talk a lot about how primary caregivers end up being the person who bears the brunt of everything, but a lot of our programs focus on a primary caregiver or only identify one person as the caregiver. And there are families, and my family was one of those, where multiple people were involved in this. So when we think about our policies and our strategies, how do we think about the different types of families and arrangements that there are to make it as inclusive as possible, to increase and include as many natural supports, sometimes is the word that we use for that, or people who are available to help in this situation, and really be thinking about all of that.
You know, you mentioned that we've talked about financial supports, but we've also talked about how every situation is different. Each of your experiences being a caregiver or working with your family has a diversity of experiences that you have to deal with and encounter. And some of that requires a lot of learning. I know in my experience, right, there was things I had to learn that I was not familiar with, tasks that I had to complete that my family members had to complete. Something that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have brought up is policies that would pay physicians, nurses, and others to train family caregivers in some of the more, let's say, like medically aligned tasks. Do you think that that would have been helpful? How would you have gauged your doctor around that sort of work? How did you learn how to take care of these tasks, and where do you think there were gaps?
I had some advantage there because I was a state-tested nurse aide in high school and college.
Oh.
But I also came from a large family where there were a lot of people who wanted to be involved but didn't always know how to be involved. I really love the idea of providers being able to be paid to help train family caregivers because I think it will help prioritize that training, and I also think it will help provide some consistency. Is it okay if I
He doesn't agree. No.
provide some consistency to how that training is happening. When we've talked to caregivers in our research, at times I remember one person talking to us about how the biggest fight she had with her husband was whenever he had to transfer from bed to chair to another surface, because he had been trained one way in therapy and she had been shown how to do it a different way, and every time they went to transfer, if you can think about the numbers of times in a day that you do that activity, they fought with each other about what was the safest way to do it. So to be able to prioritize it, for them to be trained together and to have it be more standardized or consistent across that training, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, here. Yeah, I forgot what it was for. So, I think the training of the caregiver to be a caregiver is important. But there's so much more of that conversation that's not just about being trained to be the caregiver.
Right.
And you hear a lot of people, especially any chronic health condition, but especially something like Alzheimer's or dementia, and they'll tell you the diagnose and adios story. And it's pretty universal that, well, we came in, we sat down, we were told Dad has Alzheimer's, and then they left the room. And there's so much more to the conversation than just teaching you how to be an unpaid nurse's aide. And all the things that you need to know about the change in that relationship, the change in that dynamic, and that understanding that the caregiver support is much more than learning about the disease your loved one has or how to do a transfer or pass medications. My 80-year-old father-in-law is learning to be a dialysis tech. He was a pet supply executive. It's not his background. And he'll learn to do that. But there's a whole lot more to that story than him learning how to do dialysis on my mother-in-law. And we have to think holistically about not just the physical ability of somebody to perform the task, but also every other reason that keeps them at the table, keeps them engaged, so they don't just give up.
It doesn't stop at awareness. You don't call the fire department and they say your house is on fire, have good luck. There's a process that follows, right?
The one thing I noticed with dementia, with my mom, the hardest thing for us to learn, physically, my mom was in great shape. At the age of 79, she was taking high-impact aerobics and was teaching water aerobics. She was riding a mountain bike through the mountains. So physically, we had no problems with her. It was when you have to adjust to the repeated questions, the lack of knowledge of time and space, the accepting, learning how to talk to them. I remember one doctor saying to me, I kept trying to say, no, Mom, it's Tuesday, it's not Monday. He said, stop it, stop it. She's not coming back to your world. Step into hers. Join her wherever she is. Join that conversation. And when I started accepting that and doing that, everything became easier. And this acceptance is so difficult for Alzheimer's families. I'm going to tell you a quick story. When I was still in the there's nothing wrong with mom phase, my sisters and I would take my mother to the beach every summer. We're sitting on the beach, she pulls out a magazine, it's a People magazine, she's reading through it, and she said, oh my God, Merv Griffin died. And she said, I used to watch his show all the time. He was good friends with one of the Gabor sisters. I think it was Ava. She starts telling us all this stuff about his show. We get back to the house that night, I say to my sister, did you hear her? There's nothing wrong with her memory. She remembered people on Merv Griffin 40 years ago. Next day, we go to the beach. Mom pulls out the same magazine. She's thumbing through it. Oh my goodness, Merv Griffin died. And I said, what? And she said, Merv Griffin died. You know, he was friends with one of the Gabor sisters. And I said, was it Ava? And she went through the entire conversation again. Well, by the end of the week, we turned it into a drinking game. No one drinks until Merv dies. We heard about Merv dying 5 times a day. And finally, my sister said, well, the good news is we never have to buy her another magazine. She's really enjoying this one. But that acceptance and that step into where they are is the hardest thing at the beginning. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got multiple stories. Like, so when my mom, the same day that I said, they had just come from dinner, and she said, well, I still want to have whatever they're having. So she had some, I think maybe I made pork chops. So she ate, and then she was done, and then she goes, what do you have over there? I said, I'm having pork chops. And she said, oh, I'll take some. She just ate some, you know. So then my dad's like, and I was like, and so I gave her some. I said, I hear they're good, you know. So she's, but it's like, because my dad would get upset because it's your mind, in your mind, that's not the person that you're used to. Like, you know better than that, or, you know, but they're not the same. And so it's hard to, it was really, I think my dad had the hardest time just because he didn't see her anymore, you know.
So that kind of brings me to our last question and discussion point. Obviously, there's being a lot put on family caregivers to navigate a complex system that's intellectually complex, emotionally complex, financially complex. But some of this seems to be driven by the shortage of direct primary care workforce or direct care workforce. How do you think that has exacerbated the challenges that family caregivers face? Do you have any direct experiences that yourselves in not being able to find someone who can sort of lighten the load?
And I think, yes, absolutely. My family experienced not as much of that in the 90s when we were caring for grandparents, but in the last 10 years or so, especially with the pandemic, I'm getting more and more calls from family, from friends, anyone who knows that I know anything about aging at all, to say, we're trying to get someone, we just thought we would just take care of her at home, and we can't get anybody in here. And I've had to have conversations with lots of folks around, you know, bringing services in at home is not just, you're going to do that and everything's going to be fine, because there's a lot of monitoring that goes on, there's a lot of coordinating that goes on, and because of the shortage that we're having right now, families are taking that role on even more. It's becoming almost kind of an administrative role that can be really taxing for folks too. So in helping people weigh those options, the direct care workforce shortage certainly has had, I think, a tremendous impact on caregivers, not being able to find services, adult day services, all kinds of things that during the pandemic, some of those things just went away. And
just because you're the researcher here, am I right that the fastest growing demographic in the state of Ohio are adults over the age of 60 still?
I believe that's correct, yes.
So we have a shortage while the demand is increasing.
Yes, and there is also, you know, a statistic that's been talked about quite a bit lately, is that we're reaching a point nationally where we are going to have more people over the age of, I think, 65 than we do under the age of 18.
Right.
So this is not something that's going to resolve itself. It's not something that's a new problem. We've been talking about this in aging for a long time. It's just, I think the pandemic really caused more people to experience that and feel that shortage than ever before. And it's definitely something that we need to be kind of all hands on deck, thinking about any solution that we can.
Yeah, Jennifer, you have thoughts?
So, yes, ideally you'd like to have someone at home, and as you were saying, there is a shortage. So then we looked for like adult daycare. Well, the challenge with that is, you know, like my mom was afraid because she didn't know anyone. She'd say, why are you leaving me with these people? And she did, and then I felt horrible, you know, but I was trying to give my dad a break. Like, Dad, you can go golf because she can go here. and I'll take her. And then she's like, you better not leave me. Where are you going? I'm like, Mom, and even if she's been multiple times, there's no familiar face. There was no one that she recognized.
Right.
And so that's a challenge. So ideally, we wanted to have someone come to the house and have the same person, but there wasn't anyone available because the home health care agencies we're working with had shortages, or we couldn't get people for the amount of time or the time that we needed, the variance because it was, there was a shortage.
Yeah. Wasn't available.
Right.
Orion?
I mean, some of the,
Colleen.
so the statistic on some of that is that, 80% of a care plan might be funded. So if you had a plan of care for somebody to come in 3 days a week or 4 days a week, maybe you got them 2. And that reliability of that service could be an impact. The state has addressed some of that by looking at the rates, because some of that was labor shortage was people have other options about where they can go. But that consistency and regularity of the service and the reliability of it's important. And so we have to treat that work like it's as important as we say it is, and compensate it appropriately and look after the needs of those folks, because the people providing the care are often also the lowest paid, the least likely to have benefits, and that's part of the challenge. And so if we're really serious about it, we need to honor that work. I think we've made some good steps in that in Ohio, but that's an important part of meeting that demand.
It has to be a job worthwhile to have, right? And then Colleen, our
I
final
think there
thoughts.
also has to be an acknowledgement that the family structures aren't the same as they might have been when I was a child, when all of my aunts and uncles lived in the same area, and there were huge, my mom's one of 10, my dad was one of 11. There were family support systems that we may not have right now. I think one of my best friends, his mother had retired to Florida. He's here in Ohio, and every time he would go down, he would think, she doesn't seem to be exactly right. Well, he went down one time and realized she hadn't paid bills in 6 months. And he said, Mom, why haven't you been paying these bills? And she said, I write checks, I pay the bills. Well, she hadn't written a check since January, and it was July. And so he realized now he's in a different state. He's an only child. She's alone. There's not a support system for people who are aging in place and they're alone. And I think it happens in every state where maybe, older people here in Ohio, their children are scattered all around the country. They might FaceTime with mom and dad, but that's a real difference when someone is aging in their home and can't get support. And this need to have people who are paid well enough, who are valued for the important work they're doing. What's more important than keeping your parents safe in their home? And yet we don't have a system in place to allow that to happen for families, to allow them to have their parents age with dignity and age in place. And I think resources have to be directed that way.
Yeah, very powerful. I think, first of all, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. Okay, and now we're going to exit the stage because up next we're going to hear from some AARP member volunteers from across the state sharing some of their caregiver stories. And at the conclusion of this video, which I believe you're going to see up here, State Director Holly Holzen will be, and the Department of Aging Director Ursula McElroy will be sitting down for fireside policy chat about recent changes and what's next for Ohio's long-term care system. So thank you and enjoy.